What if you could recognize the exact moment an empath starts slowly closing you out emotionally, and you could understand the hidden pattern behind it before they fully disappear from your life? Because today you're going to learn something most people never really notice. Empaths don't randomly detach. They follow a psychological sequence that runs quietly in the background. And once you understand it, you stop guessing their behavior and start reading it clearly. Here's the part most people completely misunderstand. Empaths are not slow to react. They are slow to conclude. There is a difference. They operate on a perception versus reaction model. While most people respond to what just happened, empaths track what keeps happening beneath the surface. They don't isolate moments. They connect patterns across time. They don't just hear words. They check alignment. They don't just see actions. They examine intention. And because of this, they delay reaction, not out of confusion, but out of accuracy. They are collecting information, emotional consistency, behavior patterns, subtle shifts. They notice what repeats. They notice what changes. And more importantly, they notice what doesn't match. And during this time, they may appear calm, even accepting, unbothered, present, still involved. But inside, they are building a psychological profile layer by layer, interaction by interaction. One quiet question runs in the background. Is this a moment or a pattern? And once that question is answered, everything speeds up. Because empaths don't need repetition once clarity is reached. They don't need confirmation once the pattern settles. Their behavior changes instantly, not dramatically, but clearly. So what looks like patience is actually careful observation. And what feels like tolerance is simply delayed detachment already in motion. There is a specific moment. You won't see it, you won't hear it, but it changes everything. Pattern recognition threshold. Before this point, the empath is interpreting. They are analyzing, adjusting, trying to understand the gaps between what is said and what is felt. After this point, they are no longer interpreting. They are seeing clearly, directly, without distortion. This is where emotional attachment loses its control. Because once a pattern becomes predictable, it stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural, something repeatable, something fixed. And structure is easier to detach from than emotion. Here's the shift. They stop asking, why is this happening, and start recognizing this is how it works. That single realization removes confusion. It removes the need to keep analyzing, to keep questioning, to keep hoping for a different outcome. And when confusion disappears, so does emotional investment. Because uncertainty creates attachment, but clarity creates distance. Once they see inconsistency as consistent, effort as conditional, presence as unstable, their mind categorizes the connection as non-viable, not temporarily flawed, but deeply misaligned. And once something is labeled that way, the system protects itself, not emotionally, but automatically. That's the cutoff. And once crossed, you are no longer being understood, you are being phased out. Empaths don't disappear randomly. They don't walk away on impulse, and they don't detach from single events. They respond to specific internal signals that build over time, quietly, consistently, and beneath the surface of normal interaction. 3 core triggers activate withdrawal. 1. Emotional inconsistency. Unstable presence breaks trust faster than conflict ever could. Because it is not the disagreement that creates distance, it is unpredictability. When someone's emotional state, attention, or engagement keeps shifting without clarity, it forces the empath into a constant state of internal monitoring. And over time, that constant alertness becomes mentally and emotionally draining. The nervous system starts choosing stability over connection. 2. Unreciprocated depth. When emotional investment is not returned, they begin reducing access, not as a decision at first, but as a natural response. Because empaths don't just notice imbalance, they feel it deeply. And when depth is always one-sided, the internal system begins recalibrating automatically. What was once freely given becomes carefully shared. 3. Energetic drain. When interaction consistently costs more than it gives, the nervous system flags the connection as unsustainable. This is not just emotional reaction. It is biological regulation. The body starts signaling that the exchange is no longer balanced enough to maintain. Now here is the key insight. These triggers don't create sudden reactions. They begin recalibration. The empath starts adjusting quietly. Less emotional exposure, less availability, less internal prioritization. And this happens without announcement because they are not trying to fix the external dynamic. They are restoring internal balance. But once all 3 triggers are confirmed, withdrawal becomes inevitable, not dramatic, not emotional, just necessary. When an empath begins to leave, they don't disappear all at once. There is no sudden break, no visible rupture, and no single moment that defines the exit. They follow a sequence, detachment sequence. Stage 1, emotional reduction. This is where the shift begins. Internally, depth fades first. Even if interaction continues, they stop sharing what matters on a personal level. Conversations remain, but emotional openness decreases. What used to be open becomes measured, controlled, and selective. They are still present, but no longer fully accessible. Stage 2, cognitive detachment. Next, the mental connection begins to fade. You stop occupying their mental space. In the same way, there is no longer overthinking, no internal replay, no analysis of interactions. Where there was once reflection, there is now neutrality. The mind no longer spends energy on interpretation because the need to understand starts fading away. Silence becomes normal, not confusing. Stage 3, behavioral distance. Finally, behavior aligns with internal withdrawal. Communication becomes minimal and functional. Emotional tone flattens. Presence becomes optional rather than intentional. They still respond, but without attachment behind the response. Now here is what makes this powerful. This entire process happens while they are still physically present in your life. That is why it goes unnoticed, because externally nothing seems fully broken. They are still there, still responding, still visible. But internally, access has already been restricted. And once emotional access is removed, the connection loses its influence completely. No arguments are required. No confrontation is needed. No closure is demanded because by the time physical distance appears, the psychological exit has already been completed long before. When an empath fully disconnects, they don't just leave a person, they leave a version of themselves. This is where most people misunderstand the depth of the shift. The version that once existed in that connection was built on overextension of emotional capacity. A version that overgave, overexplained, overextended. A version that placed understanding over boundaries, connection over self-preservation, and emotional harmony over internal balance. But that version no longer exists. And this is critical because the separation is not only external, it is internal restructuring. Once that shift happens, the mind does not return to its previous state because going back would require stepping into an identity they have already outgrown. And once growth happens, going backward feels unnatural. Empaths don't avoid returning out of ego, resentment, or pride. They avoid it because it no longer matches who they have become. The clarity they reached cannot be undone. The patterns they saw cannot be unseen. And once perception changes at that level, emotional memory no longer controls behavior in the same way. So even if the situation reappears, even if familiarity returns, even if emotional echoes remain, their perception has already shifted permanently. And perception controls connection. This is why their absence feels final. Not because they are holding on to emotion, but because they have moved beyond the version of reality where that connection still fit. And when someone outgrows a dynamic internally, returning is no longer a question of feeling. It becomes a question of identity consistency. And that is where the return ends before it even begins. Here is the truth most people realize too late. Empaths don't lose their power when they step away. They take it back because what may look like loss from the outside is actually an inner shift of energy, attention, and focus. This is like a quiet reversal of power. While they are emotionally involved, their attention is constantly moving outward, focused on understanding other people, keeping harmony and holding the connection together, even if it costs them something personally. Their awareness is pointed toward the emotional states of others, noticing small changes in behavior, adjusting themselves to keep the relationship steady. But the moment detachment starts, that whole pattern flips. Their attention slowly moves back inward, and that shift changes everything because real control only exists where emotional access is allowed. Once that access is taken away, the influence fades with it. There are no more emotional openings, no more easy triggers, no more ways to affect them through inconsistency. They stop looking for validation, stop needing answers from others just to feel clear, and stop reacting to unstable patterns. In that state, they become very hard to reach, not because they are cold, not because they don't feel anything, but because they are now complete inside, steady within themselves, self-controlled, self-contained, and no longer depending on anyone else for emotional balance. That is why their absence feels so final, because it is not coming from hurt alone. It comes from a place of resolution, not confusion, not drama, but a calm understanding that has fully settled inside them. And when an empath reaches that stage, They don't argue, they don't explain, they don't try to negotiate emotional space anymore. They simply leave the situation inside first, and then their actions follow. There is no need to return, no need for closure, because in their mind, the chapter is already closed. And what many people fail to understand is that this process does not happen suddenly. It builds slowly over time through repeated experiences where the empath feels unseen, unheard, or emotionally drained, and each moment adds a small layer of distance until one day the connection that once felt strong no longer holds the same meaning. And by the time others notice the change, the empath has already gone through most of the separation internally. Quietly processing, quietly understanding, quietly letting go without making noise about it. And that silence is often misunderstood because people expect reactions. They expect visible emotions. They expect some form of conflict. But what they get instead is calm distance. And that calmness can feel more intense than anger because it shows there is nothing left to fight for, nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix. And in that space, the empath is not trying to win or lose. They are simply choosing peace over confusion, clarity over mixed signals, stability over emotional chaos. And that choice changes how they move, how they speak, and how they respond to everything around them, because once they have taken their energy back, they no longer give it away so easily. They become more aware of where their attention goes, more careful about who they allow into their emotional space, and more selective about the connections they keep. Not out of fear, but out of understanding, because they have learned that not every bond is meant to be maintained, not every relationship deserves endless effort, and not every situation can be fixed by giving more of themselves. And this realization becomes a quiet form of strength that does not need to be announced. It simply shows through their actions, through their boundaries, through their silence, and through their ability to walk away without looking back. And even though others may interpret this as coldness or indifference, the truth is very different. It is a form of self-respect that has finally taken its place after being ignored for too long. And once that self-respect becomes stable, the empath no longer feels the need to chase, to explain, or to hold on to something that no longer feels right. They accept what is. They understand what cannot be changed, and they move forward without carrying the weight of what they had to leave behind. And that is where their real power begins to show, not in how much they can endure, but in how clearly they can choose themselves when it matters most. And in that choice, there is a kind of freedom that cannot be taken away because it does not depend on anyone else. It exists entirely within them, steady, quiet, and unshakable.